is Chetsang Rinpoche teachings at Taro Monastery, His Holiness Drikung Chetsang Rinpoche. You can find it on YouTube, and it is in Ladakh, the Himalayas. Chetsang Rinpoche is turning a new age soon. I received the news, and we have an event Wednesday at the Chicago Ratnashri Center to celebrate His Holiness's birthday. So if you are in Chicago, you should definitely check it out. And there will be a white Tara practice, Om Tare Tu Tare Ture Mama Ayojana Punyam Pushtum Kuru Soha, for the long life in honor of His Holiness Chetsang Rinpoche's 79th birthday. He is the head of the Drikung Kagyu school, and I will read a bit from his biography called From the Heart of Tibet, the biography of Drikung Chetsang Rinpoche, the holder of the Drikung Kagyu lineage. So a preface from my end is that recently I think a lot of people have this like inner tension, right, between egalitarianism and elitism. Obviously, like, it would be a great world if everyone was equal. And I think that was the beautiful ideal America was founded on. And happy July 4th to everyone who is American or in America. However, I think there is a necessity to recognize that, like, elitism exists for a reason throughout human history. If you look at how knowledge systems have sustained, how knowledge systems have been passed on, how scientists grew up, you will find like an interesting pattern in how they were raised, including like Steve Jobs, who is of mixed heritage. So this is not to say like a certain group of people are always going to be allowed to dominate other groups of people, but elitism does speak for itself when you look at all the really high achievers in life. It is very difficult for people who have grown up in very adverse environments to become someone who is articulate in adverse circumstances in their adulthood. I think with media, because everything is so chopped up, it is sometimes difficult to see that like your childhood can impact your adulthood, because like when we watch like videos of social media, we don't really see where this person is coming from. So sometimes it can be more convincing to others if someone has like certain amount of education or not. So like there's a very huge anti-intellectual takeover, I think, of the world in general because of the wars, etc. So that is why I think it is necessary to share with you guys some of the biographies of the great masters, and that will help certain people to understand Tibetan Buddhism as well who are not of the Buddhist path. Okay. So Rinpoche's studies with tutors in his private chambers came to an end, and he began to receive instruction in the Nima Changra, a group of 10 to 15 tukuls and selected monks. We have a picture of him, and he looks very innocent. In 1956, in Drikung Kagyu Monastery in 1956. Now, although he was 4 years younger, he studied with Chungsang Rinpoche in a group that included students from all parts of Tibet. Their teacher, Bopa Tulku Dongak Tempa, 1907 to 1959, introduced them to the philosophy of Madhyamaka. They began with basic texts such as the 37 practices of a bodhisattva and the way of the bodhisattva, but their studies would soon come to an abrupt and brutal end. In autumn of 1958, some leading Drikung lamas went to Lhasa to judge the situation themselves. So this is when the turmoil started to occur in Tibet due to the Chinese communist invasion. Some of them, including Jonyer Konchok Samten and Chetsang Rinpoche's personal attendant Solpan Chosjor, felt that it no longer made any sense to stay in Tibet, and they were considering sending Drikung Kagyu Rinpoche to India until the political situation had stabilized. Chakso Sepal, the manager of the Drikung Labrang, like the everyday activities of the Drikung monastery, seemed to agree with them. They informed the elder Sarong of their intention, and he immediately drew up a plan for Chetsang Rinpoche's escape and sent for his grandson to come to Lhasa. He wanted to get moving right away before the monastic administrators could change their minds. While Rinpoche was on his way to Lhasa, the Chakzo sought an audience with Sarong. In general, he would follow the great lord's advice, he said, cautiously weighing his words, but no preparations had been made for an immediate departure. He would send someone to Drikung who would take care of everything. Sarong was not sure whether this was a tactic to politely stall the departure or just the slow-moving caution of a monastic official who failed to recognize the urgency of the situation. Situation was very urgent. So Chakso, I think, is the title of this monastery official. When Chetsang Rinpoche arrived in Lhasa, he stayed in the house of an aunt, away from the discussions at the Sarong house. He was happy at the thought of being reunited with his family in India. Some people picked up his most important valuables and what was easy to transport from Rinpoche's chambers, especially his distinctive amulet belt of reliquaries without which he should not travel. So it's to protect him during like the different elements when you go from Tibet to India, like things can happen, bad things can happen. But the assistant did not return. Instead, a week later, an entire delegation of dignitaries came to the Sarong mansion. The manager of the monastic administration of Drikung Til, the former junior of the Labrang, senior monks from the Yangrigar monastery, village headmen, chieftains, and high-ranking officials of the Drikung district were all determined not to let their lineage holder depart under any circumstances. They argued that the Dalai Lama was still in Tibet and that no one from the great Labrangs of other monasteries had fled, and they insisted they be allowed to take Rinpoche back to Drikung. Also, happy birthday to His Holiness the Dalai Lama. We had also a Green Tara practice at the Chicago Ratnashri in honor of the Dalai Lama's birthday. Sarong was beside himself and summoned the Chakso, who put an innocent face and claimed to be taken by surprise by the Drikung dignitaries' arrival. Sarong did not believe him, and the dispute between the former commander general and the Drikung manager dragged on for half a day. Sarong pointed out that the child was doubly at risk given the communist agenda to completely eliminate the two traditional repositories of power and authority in Tibet, the monastic hierarchy and the aristocracy. What was I saying? See, Chetsang Rinpoche's grandfather was both furious and deeply disappointed. Buddhism is said to be a path to overcoming ignorance, the worst of mental poisons. But these representatives of Tibet's religion appeared blind and inflexible in the center of a disaster that was closing in on them in the face of an impending catastrophe. The monastery manager did not yield, and he even threatened to press charges against Sarong, who finally gave in with rancor and bitterness. In a final burst of rage, he demanded that the Chakso take Rinpoche and leave his house immediately. They would soon see what their decision would cost them. Sarong concealed his dejection when he told his grandson to return with the delegation to the monastery. Rinpoche was very disappointed, but he remained valiant in the face of this final separation from his family. Chetsang Rinpoche would not see his family again for 18 years. So this book also has like a picture of him with his siblings, and they did not take another photo like that for many decades. On February 8, 1959, the Tibetans celebrated the New Year, a pig year. The Dalai Lama's final examinations in Buddhist philosophy at Drikung Monastery were scheduled to take place during the Monlam festivities, but there was concern that he would be invited to attend the National People's Congress in Beijing, which would result in a deferral of his examinations. Lhasans were also uneasy, people who live in Lhasa, because PLA presence, People's Liberation Army presence, was strengthened to prevent any repeat of the pro-independence demonstrations that had taken place during Monlam in previous years. The Chinese forces were especially concerned that the freedom fighters would use the Monlam crowds to stage an uprising. In a desperate attempt to mediate between the Chinese and the resistance fighters, the powerless Tibetan government convened the National Assembly and appointed Dasang Damdul Saron to be the chief negotiator with the Chinese, but the revolt broke out before the first round of discussions could take place. Chetsang Rinpoche in a field near Lhasa, 1958. This is the last picture his father took of him before his parents left Tibet. Very, very adorable with the wheat. On the last day of the old year, the Dalai Lama had been invited to attend the performance of a dance troupe in the newly built auditorium of the PLA headquarters. The Dalai Lama had accepted the invitation to avoid giving the impression of being discourteous, but was able to get around setting a specific date until March 7th, when he finally agreed to come to 3 days later on March 10th. His hosts demanded that he appear without the usual ceremonial entourage of ministers and dignitaries and without personal bodyguards. They promised to ensure his safety. Officials in close contact with the Dalai Lama were shocked when they heard about this strange invitation issued at such short notice. The demand that he attend without bodyguards was especially disturbing. A few days earlier, the Drikung oracle had warned that the Dalai Lama should not go out, and a rumor that the Dalai Lama was to be kidnapped and detained by the Chinese spread like wildfire. By the way, Nancy Pelosi, politician and congresswoman, visited Dharamsala recently, and she also met and received the blessings of the Drikung oracle, and so that was a very auspicious moment. On the morning of March 10th, a few thousand Tibetans gathered before the Norbalinka and demanded to see the Dalai Lama, and in the heated atmosphere some Tibetans believed to be collaborators were attacked. A small group remained to barricade the streets leading to the palace, while the mob moved into the center of Lhasa chanting anti-Chinese slogans. 2 days later, 50 Tibetan officials called themselves the People's Assembly gathered in the Shoal, the village just below the Potala Palace, in support of the uprising. The largest demonstration that Lhasa had ever seen was held in Shoal the next day on March 13th. Thousands of Tibetans flooded into an open area to cheer the speakers, who demanded the restoration of Tibet's independence. When weapons were distributed from government arsenals, the situation intensified and the PLA opened fire, hoping to intimidate the crowd. The Drikung oracle advised the Dalai Lama that it was no longer safe to stay at the palace, and that night the Dalai Lama fled disguised as a layman. A select group of Khampa fighters aided his escape from the palace past the outraged demonstrators and the Chinese army, and it seems the Dharma protectors guarded them carefully. Lhasa's residents were distressed to discover that the Dalai Lama was gone and suspected he had been kidnapped. The People's Liberation Army opened a massive attack on the city, and after 3 days of intense fighting, the PRC flag flew on the roof of the Potala. Zhou Enlai declared he's a politician in China. He also received a letter from the eminent 10th Panchen Lama, 70,000 character letter some decades later to protest the situation in Tibet. And if you guys want a Chinese version of the audio of this document, I can read it, but it's kind of dry and boring, because it's all about policies. Anyways, I can read it if there's demand. Zhou Enlai declared that the uprising nullified the 17-point agreement and that China was no longer bound by any agreements. The gloves had come off. The Dalai Lama reached India on March 30th, to be followed by thousands of fellow Tibetans in the coming weeks and months, among them Tulkus, lamas, and freedom fighters, all of whom had given up hope of opposing China's overwhelming power. The disappearance of the Dalai Lama, the Kashak, and other spiritual and secular dignitaries left a vacuum of national leadership to be filled by the Chinese leaders without fear of opposition. Officially, the preparatory committee for the autonomous region of Tibet was to govern, but all real power was now effectively held by the newly created Military Control Commission of the People's Liberation Army, which instituted violently repressive measures throughout the country. The Panchen Lama was the only major traditional spiritual and secular authority remaining in Tibet, and the occupiers groomed him to become a substitute for the Dalai Lama. They installed him as the chairman of PCART, but the population largely distrusted him and regarded him as a puppet of China. Up to now, the Chinese had mainly engaged in dialogue with Tibet's aristocratic rulers, but now they tried to win over the common people by elevating them to positions of authority. The converted Tibetans were to serve as shining examples of revolutionary zeal for their countrymen, while those who resisted, including large numbers of monks and the old aristocracy, were persecuted. They were harassed, imprisoned, and sent to labor camps, including His Holiness, His Eminence Garchen Rinpoche. He was in prison, as well as another, I learned recently, a Gelug Lama who was not actually in prison, he just didn't talk. The way he survived this period was that just remaining in silence and just thinking and meditating in his room. And people were helping him to like maintain this kind of silent retreat, but he didn't call it that, because if he did, then people would like stop it. So he was very tenacious and brave, and he survived. In the grip of the Chinese, humiliation and indoctrination, Chapter 7. A mighty old stupa stood on the bank of the river near Drikung Kagyu Monastery, and Chetsang Rinpoche sat with Nangse Rinpoche next to it, watching the monks wash their robes in the river, the cloth drifting in the current, making red trails like long streaks of blood mixed with water. They heard a rider approaching long before they could see him. Mounted messengers had small bells on their horse bridles to keep them from falling asleep on their long routes. The rider stopped his horse only long enough to shout to the Chakso that Lhasa had been bombarded and taken by the Chinese, and the Dalai Lama had disappeared. Then he was gone to spread the news further down the road. The monks were bewildered. They had seen the People's Liberation Army only sporadically, as troops occasionally passed through Drikung, making little impact outside of the Lhasa area and the places where they had battled resistance fighters. A monastery council was convened, and the Dobal divination in the main shrine indicated that it would be better to remain in Tibet. The monastic officials decided to move to their administrative seat in Drikung and sent for Chuktsang Choki Nangwa, who was in Lhasa for a major ceremony. Prayers were recited around the clock in the temple of the three protector deities of Drikung, and a few monks began to retreat in order to perform the powerful practice of the wrathful protector deity Yamantaka. So in Ladakh, in Alchi, there's also like a Yamantaka on the wall. A few days after this incident, a mounted group of Khampa warriors arrived at Drikung. This is Naropa. This is the founder of the Kagyu lineage. One of the founders of the Kagyu lineage. Their leader, Drakpa Namgyal Ponritsang, was one of about 24 clan chieftains in Kham. For centuries, his family had produced the chieftains of the clan, the village headmen, and the leaders of the Drikung monastery, of which there were many, in his area of northwestern Kham. Drakpa Namgyal knew the Chinese and had traded with them, as had many in the eastern part of Tibet. He was aware of their intentions and their strength. The Khampas could not win the war, but he did not wish to surrender to the People's Liberation Army, and he led a band of loyal warriors on several successful raids until they were forced to disperse by massive PLA troop deployments and airstrikes. So these are some guardian deities before the entering the Alchi monastery, one of the monasteries in Alchi. So, yeah. 2 forms of Zambala with Achala, and there's Ganapati, Om Gam Ganapati. Drikung administrative center and monastery in 1948. The people of Kham revered the lineage holders of their monasteries even more than they did the Dalai Lama, and Drakpa Namgyal now thought only of the well-being of the Drikung holinesses. He was determined to shield Chetsang Rinpoche and Chungtsang Rinpoche from the grasp of the Chinese. Drakpa Namgyal's band, exhausted, hungry, and wounded, but still unbroken, had reached Drikung. He and two companions entered the monastery, and they first went to pay their respects to Chetsang Rinpoche in his private chambers. After they had prostrated themselves on the floor before the young Drikung holiness, Drakpa Namgyal explained to Rinpoche that the Chinese had taken over the country. The situation was grave and very dangerous, so that they had come to escort him and Chungtsang Rinpoche to India. Chetsang Rinpoche listened to his speech calmly and then told Drakpa Namgyal to speak to the Chakso. Of course, the Chakso had no intention of letting the holinesses leave. He had already refused the same request to the elder Tsarong, and he would not be intimidated by Khampa warlords brandishing weapons. He told them about the oracle's recommendation that the Rinpoches remain in Tibet, and tired but unsatisfied, the Khampas left. According to some of the survivors' stories reported later in India, the next day they spoke with the Chakso again, this time accompanied by Drakpa Namgyal's brother, Drakpa Chogyal, and Pema Lodro. They had no time to lose because Chinese troops were pursuing them, but the Chakso was unmoved. He told them that his nephew had a good relationship with the Chinese, so he felt relatively secure even in the face of this new threat. The Khampas became angry, and they shouted that the nephew deserved to die if he was collaborating with the Chinese. The nephew had prudently already fled, and the frustrated Drakpa Namgyal pointed his rifle at the manager's breast, threatening to kill him on the spot unless he let the holinesses leave. Here's a map of Nepal, if y'all need a map at this point. Up on the monastery roof, Rinpoche watched the arrival of the Chinese troops through his field glasses. Uniformed men on horseback were followed by an army of infantry. Gradually, he made out one soldier up front who was examining Drikung with his field glasses. The sound of angry voices rose up to him from the rooms below, and Rinpoche sent his personal attendant down to find out what was happening. The confrontation in the office of the Chakso had now reached its dramatic climax, with the Khampas pressing the Chakso against the wall with their weapons. Rinpoche's attendant implored him to release the manager and to leave the premises at once. They agreed, but wished to see Chetsang Rinpoche once more before leaving. Rinpoche gave each of them an achi tsungsung, a consecrated protective needle wrapped in mantras and 5 colored ribbons. On the way out, one man turned in the doorway and placed his rifle at Rinpoche's feet in an extravagant gesture of remorse. He said the weapon had killed many wild animals and even more of the enemy. It was an instrument of sin, and he requested that Rinpoche take it, destroy it, and pray for the man killed by it. Chetsang Rinpoche took the rifle and, following the Khampas down to the great portal where the broad stairs led down to the valley, he laid it on the highest step. The weapon seemed old and strangely harmless to him, now that it was detached from someone willing to and able to use it. He lifted the heaviest stone he could manage over his head and smashed it down onto the rifle with all his strength. So, if this was a rock. The Khampas turned when they heard the crash. Relieved, they folded their hands in reverence, sprang onto their horses, and galloped away. Rinpoche hastened back up to the roof to watch the large band of Khampa fighters with their noble horses disappear into the Shorong Valley. Years later, he learned that Drakpa Namgyal had succeeded in fleeing with several of his men, although many, including his brother Drakpa Chogyal, died in their last battle with the PLA on the Indian border. Just the evening before, Chogyal had shown the others that his protective needle was broken. So, like, the story is trying to say that the needle had really ritualistic effects that protected the soldiers from perishing in combat. 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 From the roof, Rinpoche watched the Chinese cavalry approaching the monastery on their large, powerful horses. A Tibetan who tried to flee was captured, bound, and led off. His small Tibetan horse would have been no match for the faster Chinese steeds. The troops crossed the bridge and made camp on the pastures directly below the monastery. Across the river, 3 soldiers dismounted and positioned 3 high-caliber artillery guns. The monks were all frightened, wondering whether the People's Liberation Army was going to attack Drikung Kagyu. The Chakso ordered that white scarves be tied to staffs placed next to the main entrance, but the Chinese soldiers seemed not to take note of these. They set up their field kitchen, lit fires, and cooked their midday meal. The Chakso and the monks decided to speak with the Chinese as a delegation, approaching the camp with white scarves in their hands, and according to rank as tradition required, first the Chakso, followed by the treasurer, the chief secretary, the undersecretary, the commissary of supplies, and finally the head of the monastery lumber yard. The PLA officers demanded the surrender of all the weapons in the monastery, including every knife with a blade of a hand's length, and threatened the delegation with severe penalties if even one weapon was to be found later. A single old rifle was handed over, along with many swords, daggers, and knives that had hung on the walls of the Dharma Protector's temple. Additional troops arrived through the course of the day, and tents lay scattered all over the open fields. The soldiers seemed to have been on the march for a long time. Some dropped down onto their packs and did not move, while others leaned against the walls of villagers' houses and fell asleep. They weren't given much time to rest, as the troop commander soon roused them to chase the Khampa fighters. The local people indicated that the Khampas had ridden off to the Longsho Valley, but the truth was that they had gone in the opposite direction. Fortunately for the Khampas, the PLA commander believed that the locals would help him, and his soldiers marched off in the wrong direction. The following day, a siren wailed in the distance, signaling that the combat aircraft was approaching, and everybody had to leave the building immediately. Chetsang Rinpoche hung all of his precious amulets around his neck and ran to the hill behind the monastery to hide behind a large peach tree surrounded by frightened monks. A plane approached and circled a few times above the monastery complex before turning aside and flying off toward Lhasa. Before it disappeared, they saw flames on the horizon and heard the deep thunder of explosion. Later, they were told that the warplane had bombed a group of fleeing Khampas. After a tense but quiet week, a company of soldiers appeared again and settled permanently in Songsho, the village below the monastery. The PLA requisitioned the largest house in the area and turned it into their local headquarters. Tibet was under martial law, and the Chinese soldiers herded all of the leading monastic officials and the Chakso into a single room, placed them under house arrest, and began a systematic search of the monastery complex. Rinpoche's field glasses and 7 or 8 old seals of gold and silver were confiscated. The offices were all ransacked in a search for suspicious documents and then sealed off. The commander treated the young Drikung holinesses with marked respect. However, and twice he invited them to dine with him. The 2 Rinpoches were too intimidated to start a conversation, despite the officers' efforts to put them at ease. After the meal, he offered his astonished young guests cigarettes, which they declined, but the officer laughed and insisted until they accepted. One day, Chakzo Sepel and leading monastic officials were to be transferred to the prison in the district capital, Manjughosha. When the villagers saw them heaved onto horseback, they surrounded the Chinese soldiers, begging them to let the monks stay. The soldiers were annoyed, but not yet willing to resort to harsher methods, and the monks were taken back to the monastery. Every day, officers came to conduct interrogations. The timid Chongtsang Rinpoche usually ran away and hid, so the soldiers sought out Chetsang Rinpoche more often. Once, the troop commander burst into Rinpoche's room with another PLA officer and an interpreter. He sat down, looked calmly around the room, and took some snuff before having the monastery's chief secretary and his assistant summoned. The commander's manner suddenly changed when he came in, and he shouted violently at both of them, accusing them of being agitators and shaking a bundle of papers he claimed to be subversive letters. Subversive letters. The commander shouted in Chinese, the interpreter in Tibetan, "Did you write these letters or not?" Why, oh why, did I get incarnated as a fish and as a tortoise, when I could have been any of these? Dim-witted was I not to think of these. Futile is it to cry over the past. When they did not respond, he sprang up, shouted, and stamped his feet so hard the noise reverberated throughout the entire monastery. Chetsang Rinpoche had never witnessed such a frightening spectacle as the display of fury. With the officer's trembling thighs and his red, distorted face and cruel expression, like the mask of a demon. Rinpoche escaped from the room and cowered in a corner behind a terrace wall. After a while, when he heard a few curt orders and many footsteps going downstairs, he cautiously crept out of his hiding place and saw the secretaries being bound and locked up in some rooms the military had taken over. Some days later, they were sent to a labor camp near Manjughosha I. After a month of the monastery's occupation, a group of civilian Chinese cadres and Tibetan supporters arrived to begin a program of patriotic re-education. 爱国教育. 劳动改造, that's labor reform re-education. And then patriotic re-education is something like 爱国教育. All of the monks were subjected to repetitive speeches informing them that religion existed only to delude and exploit the populace, to secure the power of the privileged classes, and to oppress ordinary people. The monks were assembled at Nima Changra, where the Chinese had set up their regional administration, while the tulkus, kempos, and the high-ranking lamas convened at Drikung Kagyu. They were all forced to listen to tedious propaganda speeches, which often lasted for hours, and to study communist pamphlets. Each monk was asked to articulate what he had absorbed, and if the instructors did not like what they heard, the victim had to endure a tongue lashing about his reactionary thinking, obstinacy, and backwardness, and about the necessity of cultivating a revolutionary spirit. When it was Chetsang Rinpoche's turn to respond, he was petrified, as everything the instructors had been saying seemed like incoherent ranting to him. He begged Rigyal Rinpoche to help him, although the latter, too, understood very little of what the instructor said. When a young Tibetan woman with a fanatical expression on her face turned to Chetsang Rinpoche, Rigyal said, "He is too young, he understands nothing." The Tibetan woman looked at the frightened boy and seemed to attempt a contemptuous face without success. She appeared confused for a moment, but then turned to the next monk to be questioned. Rinpoche was relieved until he was informed that he would be questioned the next day. He didn't know what to do. There were so many topics, and he could not make sense of any of them. He decided to memorize one of these texts, and did so easily, although he desperately hoped that no one would ask him what it meant. When his turn came, he hastily recited the text he had prepared, and the instructors seemed to be amused and placated by his performance. At least they laughed dryly, and from then on, no one asked Chetsang Rinpoche any more questions, although he still had to attend all of the assemblies. The re-education program lasted a few months. Even though no one in Drikung Kagyu was forced to disrobe and take up a relationship with a woman, something that was often imposed in other monasteries, many of the monks were unable to bear the psychological terror. They expected to be put in labor camps or prisons, or even to be killed. Some committed suicide, throwing themselves into the river, while others managed to sneak away. Fewer appeared for indoctrination with each passing day. Soon, only half of what had been 60 inmates remained. Chetsang Rinpoche's playmate, Nangshe Rinpoche, tried to flee with his tutor and another monk, taking cover during the day and traveling by night, but a military patrol spotted them and opened fire. Nangshe Rinpoche fell and broke his legs. Recaptured, he was treated in an army hospital. One afternoon, soldiers appeared in the assembly hall and made a list of the remaining inmates. When they left, they assured the monks that they would not return and said their farewells courteously, but no one trusted them. The senior monks, convinced that they would be sent to prison, prepared to leave, packing their few possessions and donning layman's clothing. When the villagers heard about the visit by the military and the ominous list, they came to the Zong in hordes, wailing and lamenting and pleading with the occupiers not to carry off the monks and Rinpoches. The Chinese soldiers were astonished and troubled by this spontaneous outburst of civic courage and promised to leave the remaining monks in peace. But the villagers did not trust them, checking later that night to see whether all of the monks were still there. Everything seemed quiet, so they returned to their homes. During that night, Chetsang Rinpoche woke from a deep sleep to find Norbu Rinpoche shaking him and shouting, "Wake up, fast! The soldiers have come back. We have to go down right away or they will shoot us. Everyone is downstairs already. Only you are still here." In the blackness of night, Rinpoche hastily slipped into his robes, but his agitation failed him. He could not find his belt and had to hold his lower robe up with one hand. He groped the wall with the others to find the door and stumbled downstairs, where he saw Chungsang Choki Nangwa together with the other Rinpoches and monks standing in the middle of the assembly hall, crowded together like a herd of timid sheep. All were wearing layman's clothing and some had bundles tied together. Soldiers surrounded them. As soon as Chetsang Rinpoche and Norbu arrived, the soldiers raised their rifles and barked an order to march. Paralyzed with fear, no one moved, and the soldiers began to shout insults and strike the men with the rifles. Finally, Chetsang Rinpoche pushed his way to the front and began to walk in the direction the soldiers had indicated. Chetsang Rinpoche followed him. Chungsang Rinpoche followed him, and then the others. Chetsang Rinpoche thought they were going to be executed and wondered if it would hurt when the bullet ripped through his body. He was trembling, but he continued down the 3 flights of stairs to the ground floor of the monastery. Outside, a severe storm was raging, as if the elements were as agitated as the humans that night. It thundered in rapid succession, and lightning bolts revealed terrified men kneeling on the ground with arms raised to defend themselves from scowling soldiers. In another flash of lightning, Chetsang Rinpoche saw Chakso Sepel and his deputy with lacerations on their heads and arms, cowering in front of the wall, their hands tied behind their back. Rinpoche could make out 8 other men standing in front of the wall, all bound in a row with their hands tied. They were the Drikung officials. Rinpoche struggled to hold up his robes in the violent storm, and he didn't know whether his body was shaking from the cold or fear. In a flash of light, a Tibetan interpreter for the Chinese army saw the boy and tried to comfort him, whispering nothing would happen, but Rinpoche didn't know whether he could believe him or not. Then the Tibetan translated the commander's curt words. "These 10 shameless creatures will be imprisoned. The others will work for the benefit of the people in the labor camp. If they confess their faults in the right and the proper fashion, they will enjoy better conditions and will be able to return home soon. Otherwise, they will face the same fate as these incorrigibles here." Finally, the Tibetan interpreter announced, "The 2 Drikung Tulkus and Norbu Tulku have successfully completed the re-education program. They may return to their rooms." The 3 ran back into the building, and Chetsang Rinpoche dashed up all 5 floors to the roof, where he tried to make out what was happening down below. In the lightning flashes, he saw the field filled with soldiers ready to fire on their captives, some of whom seemed to be rolling around helplessly on the ground. At the shrill sound of a whistle, the troops assembled and ordered the monks to line up in a row. Flanked by the soldiers, they were marched down the broad steps and away into the dark valley. The concerned villagers who had tried to prevent this would wake to find only 3 underage Rinpoches left in the otherwise empty stronghold. The 3 boys were helpless. Until now, attendants had taken care of everything, and they didn't even know how to cook their food. While they were discussing what to do, 2 Gelug monks appeared. 2 Gelug monks appeared. It sounds like a fantasy, like, even though it's very serious political stuff, but magic does happen in the worst circumstances, like the Gelug monk who managed to survive like worse things, because I think they were associated with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, so they endured like more severe punishment than the Drikung Kagyu school in the 20th century of Chinese occupation. 2 Gelug monks appeared, sent to look after them, but also obviously to monitor them. The elder of the two turned out to be very good-natured and kindly, and when they were alone, he whispered to Chetsang Rinpoche that he could be trusted, as he was related to Drikung Kagyu Rinpoche. Chetsang Rinpoche found that reassuring, but he did not have much confidence in the younger of the two monks. Their provisions consisted of nothing more than barley flour and sema, a type of pea normally used as feed for horses and mules, occasionally supplemented by small pieces of dried meat and potatoes provided by villagers. The boys had little to do in Drikung Tong, and no one knew what to expect next. The Rinpoches passed some time exploring the huge monastery complex, much of which had been previously off limits to them, and Chetsang Rinpoche was curious to know that the newly sealed rooms what they might contain. Tibetan doors stand on high sills that can be removed with some skill and effort, so the boys were able to wriggle under the doors without damaging the seals, but they found only empty rooms. Everything of value had already been removed, except for a small amount of gold leaf and mercury, used for gilding statues left in one suic chamber. In Kham, where people's feelings for the monasteries ran far deeper, the villagers removed and safely hid many valuable objects from the Drikung monasteries, including ritual objects and musical instruments. After the Cultural Revolution had ended and sanctions somewhat relaxed, these objects of vital importance to Tibetan religious life were brought out of their hiding places and returned to the monasteries. But this was not so in Drikung, where the villagers sold the artifacts to Nepalese traders for a pittance, returning nothing to the monasteries. Norbu returned to his nomad family. Chungtsang Rinpoche sat into a listless, gloomy state. But spirited Chetsang Rinpoche, his energy remained unbroken. The empty Dzong soon lost all mystery, and he wanted to venture further afield. He had always been under the strict supervision of attendants and guards who had not allowed him to engage with ordinary people and their everyday experiences, and now only the two Gelug monks trailed after him. At first, he was shy when he ventured down to the village, and so many people stared at him. The army headquarters, with a few remaining soldiers, was still in the village, straining the atmosphere. Many Tibetans wanted to receive Rinpoche's blessings, but they were too intimidated to approach him. But Rinpoche soon became accustomed to their behavior and enjoyed his outings into a previously unknown freedom. Every day, Chetsang Rinpoche went down to the village, led the mules to pasture and rode them, and fetched water from a shallow river tributary of the Longsho River. Winter was coming, and a layer of ice covered the stream, so he had to break a hole in the ice to draw water. He would then load 2 mules with the containers and lead them uphill again. Fetching water was supposed to be a job for ordinary monks, out of the question for a Rinpoche, and unthinkable for a throne holder, but he was thoroughly enjoying this activity. He felt as if he had been deprived of the most delightful tasks of all those years. Chungtsang Rinpoche never left the building, though he sometimes watched his friend from the roof terrace, lost in his own thoughts. Chetsang Rinpoche roamed alone, exploring the surrounding area thoroughly. 3 neighboring families who lived apart from the others secretively invited him into a kitchen, offering him the place of honor, and served him tea. Chatong. This is Taiza tea. So cha in Tibetan and Mandarin, they're the same. That's why I remember it so well. I watched this in one of the movies recommended to me, and it's also something that elite Tibetans would say to like Chinese officials visiting their house, like "chato," and then once you have tea, like somehow like all the problems are gone. When he left, they gave him a piece of dried meat so large he could hardly carry it. Every now and then, a tall army officer came up to the monastery, carrying an air rifle for shooting birds. Rinpoche knew almost no Chinese, and the few fragments he understood were bad words as far as he could tell. He made a game of answering, straight-faced and calm voice with Tibetan words that were at least as bad, while the officer looked at him with both scorn and confusion. Rinpoche welcomed every change in routine and so enjoyed even this grumpy, ill-tempered man. Once, wanting to show off his agility, he climbed onto the high wooden frame of a gate, but it broke apart and he tumbled down onto the stone stairs below. Luckily, he wasn't badly hurt, but the officer scolded him with gestures, suggesting that if he had struck his head, it would have been the end of him. One day, a messenger from Tritsab Jabra appeared with a summons to bring Rinpoche to Lhasa. Thanks to his good contacts, the Drikung regent had obtained permission to take in the boy as his adoptive son. Rinpoche could hardly believe his luck, but he was sorry too because Chungtsang Rinpoche had to stay behind. He did not have much to pack. Tritsab Rinpoche even advised him to leave his amulet belt with its beautiful reliquaries behind with his nephew Gelug. Rinpoche would not learn until much later of the reign of terror that began in Drikung after he had gone. A few days after his departure, Chungtsang Rinpoche was taken into custody and transferred to the army's main headquarters in the Nyingma Changra. Chapter 8, School Years Under the Red Banner. Shortly after the flight of the Dalai Lama, the People's Republic began to implement training programs to raise class consciousness throughout the country. Even in remote rural areas, people were charged with having counter-revolutionary attitudes. Nomads who had never laid eyes on a rebel and knew nothing of what had happened in eastern Tibet and in the major cities were accused of having given aid and comfort to rebels because they had offered food to pilgrims who had subsequently fled to India. At the same time, the destruction of the monasteries that had been going on for years in Kham was now spreading throughout the country. Tibetan functionaries often looted the monasteries together with collaborators. Priceless religious antiquities were sold on the international art market for hard currency. Less valuable statues were melted down, and most of the rest were senselessly destroyed. Instead of winning over the ordinary Tibetans as was intended, these policies resulted in deepening the antagonism between the Chinese occupiers and the Tibetans into an unbridgeable rift. A massive exodus of Tibetans began in 1959, driven by the zealous programs intended to uproot and destroy everything in the traditional order. Monks all over the country were forced to spend their time in mass meetings and public struggle sessions rather than in religious studies and practice. For months at a time, the same propaganda slogans blared over loudspeakers heard everywhere in the monasteries. A number of monks from Drikung monasteries in Ladakh had been pursuing their religious education in Drikung Til and Yangri Gar when the PLA took these over. Oh, poor Ladakhis. Although the monks were Indian citizens, they weren't allowed to leave the country. Rather, they were accused of being agents of imperialist powers and interrogated as though they were exposed spies. Finally, after a few months, they were expelled from the monastery and deported. 10 Ladakhi monks, Tokden Rinpoche among them, were thrown in prison before being eventually taken to Lhasa on horseback and then deported. The remaining monks and the local population were summoned to the regional headquarters of the People's Liberation Army at Nyingma Changra, where the political re-education and struggle sessions were intensified. First, the high-ranking monks and tulkus had to describe in detail everything their subordinates had to do for them, thus providing examples of how the ordinary monks had been only exploited in the clerical hierarchy. Then the people's tribunals, the dreaded struggle sessions, began, in which lay people made accusations against individual lamas, tulkus, and aristocrats. But rather than giving spontaneous performances, the selected accusers had been forced to rehearse their statements and actions. Naturally, there was always someone who bore a grudge of some sort against one or another of those to be accused, and the Communist Party ideology simply provided the excuse for petty revenge and the settling of old scores. Others were bullied and intimidated into participating. Chungtsang Rinpoche was brought before a people's tribunal where he was forced to bow his head and kneel down to confess his alleged faults. The crowd closed in around him. One of his attendants was in front row. His name was Monlam. Monlam was forced to attack him viciously, place a pointed dunce cap on his head, and write insulting words on it. The crowd vilified Chungtsang Rinpoche as a capitalist and exploiter, spat on him, threw stones at him, and kicked him. Some women took off their underskirts and pulled them over Chungsang Rinpoche's head. Those whose zeal was not up to par was taken aside by a Chinese officer and berated for being incorrigible and condemned to further indoctrination themselves or sent to a labor camp. Tritsub Japra could read the signs of the times, and he knew how to come to terms with those in power. He had left the monastery in 1956 after the monkey year teachings and married the beautiful young Acha Chonyi, who some said was an emanation of Drikung Protectoress Achi Choki Droma. Sadly, she died shortly thereafter. Tritsab Rinpoche went on a pilgrimage to India and considered remaining there, but eventually decided to return to Tibet. On his journey, he met the renowned Nyingma master Dingo Khyentse Rinpoche, 1910 to 1991, in Gangtok, and requested that the master come to Drikung to give the holinesses the initiation of Damnatso, treasury of oral instructions containing the essential practices of the essential teachings of the 8 practice lineages. Khyentse Rinpoche consented, but the revolt in Lhasa broke out soon after, and he fled with his family to Bhutan. So Gangtok is in Sikkim, which was later incorporated into India, and in Bhutan, the Nyingma's masters have much more political support. Religious life had come to a dead end in Tibet, and the party officials rewarded Tritsab Japra's change to lay status with a high position in the Department of Religious Affairs. Chetsang Rinpoche returned to his native city in layman's clothing without an escort or attendants. The city and its inhabitants looked different. The houses bore scars of machine gun fire, and people's faces appeared tense with suffering and fear. Rinpoche was informed that his family home had been confiscated and that his grandfather had died in prison. Neither he nor Tritsab Rinpoche asked any questions for fear of drawing unwanted attention to themselves, since denunciation and harassment were ever-present dangers that could be triggered by the wrong word or the wrong question. Many years earlier, Dasang Dangdo Sarong had shown a small box of diamond splinter to Heinrich Harrer and said that he would swallow them when all other avenues were closed. But the details of his actual death aren't known. Rinpoche did not brood over his tragic situation. His concern was to survive without losing his optimism and joy in life, even in the face of catastrophe. He always had a special ability to minimize the attention he devoted to his own suffering, recognizing it as it crossed his mind and then departed like a passing guest. Tritsab and Chetsang Rinpoche lodged in a government guest house that had formerly been the residence of the aristocratic Pala family. A short time later, Tritsab Japra was sent to accompany the PLA on an expedition against the still rebellious Khampas, since Japra both knew the routes through the wild region and was highly respected by the rural population. Some Tibetans later accused him of having been a collaborator, but he only cooperated because he knew that if he refused, he would be put on a work gang building roads or thrown into a lightless dungeon. After Tritsab left, Rinpoche lived in the guest house with Gelug, Tritsab's nephew, for a few months. This description of their lodging was, at best, a euphemism. The building was dilapidated, with broken windows and a facade peppered with bullet holes. In his dreary room, the bed sheets were smeared with dried blood, and Rinpoche preferred to sleep on the floor with blankets. The kitchen was also squalid, but it was slightly more bearable than his room, so he and Gelug spent most of their time there, although they had hardly anything to eat. As Tritsab Japra and his family were not natives of Lhasa, they did not qualify for ration cards, so it was also impossible for Gelug to get food. Chairman Mao wanted to transform China into a great industrial nation overnight, and in 1959 he announced the Great Leap Forward and forced millions of people, mostly farmers, into industrial communes. Miniature blast furnaces were set up in almost every village, but the steel they produced were worthless, and many workers became ill from unhealthy labor conditions. The mandatory conscription into the industrial labor force left too few farmers, especially since the quotas for agricultural production were quadrupled in order to export meat and grain to the Soviet Union in exchange for constructing an atomic bomb. Aid for constructing an atomic bomb. Radio Beijing announced harvest surpluses while the country experienced the greatest famine caused by human action in history. Estimates vary, but in 1961 and 62, some 20 to 40 million people died. If you want to read more on this history, you can read Dr. Mr. Yang Sheng. I don't know if he's a doctor or not. Let me check. He wrote a book on like the horrific consequences based on like field research. Tombstone, the Great Chinese Famine. He's a journalist and author. He's not a PhD. Anyways, I'll stop here today and I will read some dedications recommended by Garchen Rinpoche to dedicate our merits every day. And you can enter your number of dedications on the Drikung Kagyu Garchen Institute, the Garchen Institute website. So every once you can enter +1 on the main website. It's on the right-hand side of the web page. So his appeal: this year, all my disciples should recite the dedication prayer from Way of the Bodhisattva by Shantideva. Regardless of their religious background, all sentient beings wish to be free from suffering and enjoy happiness. If you recite and accumulate this dedication prayer for the benefit of all sentient beings, billions of Buddhas will join you in your recitation. Page 61. Dedication. By the virtue I have now amassed, by the composition of this book, which speaks of entry to the Bodhisattva way, may every being tread the path to Buddhahood. May beings everywhere who suffer torment in their minds and bodies have, by virtue of my merit, joy and happiness in boundless measure. As long as they may linger in samsara, may their present joy know no decline, and may they taste of unsurpassed beatitude in constant and unbroken continuity. Throughout the spheres and reaches of the world, in hellish states wherever they may be, may beings fettered there, tormented, taste the bliss and peace of Sukhavati. May those caught in the freezing ice be warmed, and from the massing clouds of Bodhisattva's prayers, may torrents rain in boundless streams to cool those burning in infernal fires. May forests where the leaves are blades and swords become sweet groves and pleasant woodland glades, and may the trees of miracles appear, supplanting those upon the hill of Shalmali. And may the very pits of hell be sweet, with fragrant pools all perfumed with the scent of lotuses, be lovely with the cries of swan and goose, and waterfowl so pleasing to the ear. May fiery coals turn into heaps of jewels, the burning ground become a crystal floor, the crushing hills celestial abodes, adorned with offerings the dwelling place of Buddhas. May the hail of lava, fiery stones, and weapons henceforth become a rain of blossoms. May those whose hell it is to fight and wound be turned to lovers offering their flowers. And those engulfed in fiery Vetarani, their flesh destroyed, their bones bleached white as kunda flowers, may they, through all my merit strength, have godlike forms, and sport with goddesses and Mandakinis' peaceful streams. What fear is it, they'll ask, that grips the henchmen of the deadly Lord, the frightful vultures and the carrion crows? What noble strength is it that brings us joy and drives away our dreadful night? And looking skyward, they will see the shining form of Vajrapani. Then may their sins be quenched in joy, and may they go to him. And when they see the seething lava flood of hell extinguished in a rain of blossoms, drenched in scented water, at once fulfilled in bliss, they'll ask, how can this be? And thus the denizens of hell will see the one who holds the lotus. Friends, throw away your fears and quickly gather here, for who is it who comes to banish dread, this youth with bound-up gleaming hair, this loving bodhisattva, saving and protecting every being, whose power relieves all pain, increasing joy? Do you see the splendor of his house that echoes praises of 1,000 goddesses? The 100 gods who lay their diadems before his lotus feet, the rain of flowers falling on his head, his eyes moist with compassion. Thus may those in hell cry out seeing Manjughosha. And likewise when, through these my virtues, through these my roots of virtue, they see the joyful cloud let fall their cooling scented rain, their obscurations cleansed by bodhisattvas like Samantabhadra, may all those languishing in hell come now to perfect happiness. And may the stooping animals be free from fear of being preyed on, each other's food, and may the famished spirits have much joy, as those who dwell within the northern continent. And may they be replete and satisfied by streams of milk that pour from noble Lord Avalokita's hand, and bathing in it may they be refreshed and cooled. And may the blind receive their sight, and may the deaf begin to hear, and women near the time bring forth, like Maya Devi, free from any pain. And may the naked now be clothed, and all the hungry eat their fill, and may those parched with thirst receive pure waters and delicious drink. May the poor and destitute find wealth, the haggard and the careworn joy. May confidence relieve those in despair, and bring them steadfastness and every excellence. May every being ailing with disease be freed at once from every malady. May all the sickness that afflicts the living be instantly and permanently healed. May those who go in dread have no more fear. May captives be unchained and now set free. And may the weak receive their strength. May living beings help each other in kindness. May travelers upon the road find happiness no matter where they go, and may they gain without the need of toil the goals on which they set their hearts. May those who put to sea in boat or ship attain the ports that they desire, and may they safely come to shore, the sweet reunion with their kith and kin. May those who lose their ways and stray in misery find fellow travelers, and safe from the threat of thieves and savage beasts, be tireless and their journey light. May children and the old, the weak, protectorless, bewildered in the wild and pathless wastes, and those whose minds are dulled, and all who are insane, have pure celestial beings as their guardians. May all attain the human state and be possessed of wisdom, faith, and love. With perfect livelihood and sustenance, may they have mindfulness throughout their lives. May everyone have unrestricted wealth, just like this treasury of space, enjoying it according to their wish, without a trace of harm or enmity. May beings destitute of splendor become magnificent and bright, and those worn down by toil and drudgery acquire great beauty and perfection. May all the women in this world attain the strength of masculinity, and may the lowly come to excellence, the proud and haughty lose their arrogance. And thus by all the merit I have gained, may every being, leaving none aside, abandon all their evil ways, embracing goodness now and evermore. From bodhicitta may they never separate, and constantly engage in bodhisattva deeds, and may they be accepted as disciples by the Buddhas, and turn aside from what is Mara's work. And may these beings, each and every one, enjoy an unsurpassed longevity, living always in contentment. May the very name of death be strange to them. On every side, in all the 10 directions, may groves of wish-fulfilling trees abound, resounding with the sweetness of the teachings spoken by the Buddhas and their bodhisattva children. And may the earth be wholesome everywhere, free from boulders, cliffs, chasms, flat and even like a level palm, and smooth like lapis lazuli. And for many circles of disciples, may multitudes of bodhisattvas rise in every land, adorning them with every excellence. From bird song and the sighing of the trees, from shafts of light and from the sky itself, may living beings, each and every one, perceive the constant sound of Dharma. May they come into the presence of the Buddhas and meet with bodhisattvas, offspring of the same, with clouds of offerings unbounded. May the teachings of the world be worshipped. May kindly spirits bring the rains on time, for harvests to be rich and plentiful. May princes rule according to the truth, and may the world be blessed with all prosperity. May medicines be strong and full of virtue. May healing spells be chanted with success. May spirits of the air that feed on flesh be kind, their minds imbued with pity. It is at 1 hour and 6 minutes right now. And let no being ever suffer pain. Let them neither ail nor languish, never doing evil. May they have no fear nor suffer insults, and may their minds be ever free from sorrow. In monasteries, temples, and the like, may reading and reciting widely flourish. May harmony prevail among the Sangha, and may its purpose be all fulfilled. May ordained monks intent upon the practice find perfect places for retreat in solitude, abandon every vagrant thought, and meditate with trained and serviceable minds. May nuns have all their wants supplied. May quarreling vindictiveness be strange to them. Let all who have embraced monastic life uphold a pure and unimpaired observance. May they feel regret when discipline is broken, and always may they strive to cleanse away their faults. May they thus obtain a fortunate rebirth wherein to undertake unfailing discipline. May the wise and learned be revered, and always be sustained by offerings. With minds suffused with purity, may their renown spread far and wide. May beings never languish in lower realms. May pain and hardship be unknown to them. Enjoying more than godlike strength and beauty, may Buddhahood for them be swiftly gained. Again and yet again, many sentient beings make offerings to all the Buddhas. With Buddha's unimagined bliss, may they enjoy undimmed and constant happiness. May all the bodhisattvas now fulfill their high intention for the sake of beings, and sentient beings likewise now receive the good the Buddhas have in store for them. And may the arhats and pratyeka Buddhas at length attain their perfect happiness, and may I also, through Manjushrie's kindness, reach the ground of perfect joy, and throughout the stream of all my lives embrace monastic ordination. Thus may I abide, sustained by simple ordinary fare, and in every life obtain a dwelling place in perfect solitude. Whenever I desire to gaze on him, or put to him the slightest question, may I behold the unobstructed vision of Manjughosha, my protector. To satisfy the needs of beings dwelling in the 10 directions to the margins of the sky, may I reflect in every deed the perfect exploits of Manjushri. And now, as long as space endures, as long as there are beings to be found, may I continue likewise to remain to drive away the sorrows of the world. The pain and sorrows of all wandering beings, may they ripen wholly on myself, and may the virtuous company of bodhisattvas bring about the happiness of beings. May the doctrine, only remedy for suffering, the source of everyday bliss and happiness, be nurtured and upheld with reverence, and throughout a vast continuance of time endure. And now to Manjughosha I prostrate, whose kindness is the wellspring of my good intent, and to my virtuous friends I also bow, whose inspiration gave me strength to grow. Shout out to my friends in Jammu. They were a huge source of support during these difficult times. And happy birthday again to Chetsang Rinpoche, and I hope everyone in our Drikung Sangha is very happy. And I will go now to add this daily prayer.